Hello everybody, my name is Nubad and welcome back to another Borderlands 4 Amon build concept video. Now I already know I put out one of the videos and in my head I thought that was going to be the only one I was going to post. But in the process of doing that, I thought it'd be a bit of a funny idea slash experiment to come up with a few other day one builds prior to the game coming out. Just because I think it'd be a pretty interesting concept to sort of theorycraft the builds before the game even comes out, before we even know what works and what doesn't, as opposed to what actually works in the game once we play through it, test it, get all the comms, enhancements, firmware and like weapons and all those sort of things that are going to be, that you're going to be looting as you play through the game. So I thought I'd come up with a couple more builds and this time around I wanted to do an Onslaught focused tree for Amon. Now for those uninitiated with Amon, the Onslaught skill tree is all about close range melee gameplay. So for the Onslaught action skill itself, basically Amon readies his big ass fist, and while he does that, he gains constant shield regen, bonus fire damage with guns, and increased movement speed. Now during this, you can still use your primary weapons, which is great, so you're not limited to only doing melee, but that in itself synergizes nicely with the build concept for this setup that I put together today. Doing your standard attacks, action skill or melee button will do a sort of rocket punch, so if you've seen the gameplay, you basically dash towards the enemy and punch him in the face. This deals fire melee attack damage in a little bit of an AoE and causes stagger. Now, bosses can't be staggered, but badass enemy types have a chance to be staggered, which is really useful from a CC perspective as well. So that's what the action skill does. And the whole point of this skill tree setup that I put together today, and I'll put the link for this mobilytics tree in the description down below as well, so you can have a look through it, and the description that I've written up in case videos aren't your thing. The point of this gameplay is basically to be in as close, in-your-face type range of the enemies as possible, using your action skill, doing melee damage, and also triggering executes on low health enemies. And I'll get into why that works and how that works in a little bit. So in terms of the skills that we pick up, so like the previous video, I'm going to refer to trunks and branches. Trunks are basically the solid part in the middle, the top half of the skill tree, and the branches are the things that come off the trunk. So in terms of tier 1 skills that we picked up for this build, we picked up Discombobulate and Impetus. Impetus is a kill skill and gives Amon increased shield regen and movement speed for a duration. Obviously with this build we're going to be killing a lot of enemies, hopefully, and this gives us survivability by making sure our shield or armor gets regen quickly and we can move a bit quicker as well to close the gap between enemies, but also dash out if needed. We also pick up Discombobulate. This gives Amon crit hit chance for his melee. Very useful because we're going to be doing a lot of melee, so being able to crit, like I was saying in the previous video, it's got to work very nicely with crit damage and all those sort of things in the damage formula. For the tier 2s, we pick up Titanium Knuckles, which gives Amon increased melee damage and skill damage. Once again, ties in nicely with Onslaught, that instant damage you get with the guns, shield regen, and the movement speed as well. Plus now we get increased melee damage, which is part of this skill tree setup anyway. We also pick up Gut Punch. Now, before I progress this any further, one thing I want to specify and sort of explain is Amon's weakness mechanic. Now, everyone hates it when we talk about slag, but it's the simplest way to explain how weakness works. Now, weakness is an Amon specific debuff, and it basically, enemies that get weakened from Amon's attacks or action skills, or these skills that proc the weakness status effect on enemies, basically makes the enemy deal reduced damage and take increased damage. And obviously if we're planning to do this to a lot of enemies, we're weakening them by making sure they do a lot less damage, but also take more damage. So getting into their face with close range weaponry, or even shooting them at range and then closing the gap with your fists and punching them and finishing them off is going to be very useful. Now, the weakness debuff is considered a status effect, and because of that, it gets affected by things like status effect duration, status effect chance, and so on and so forth. So in this tree, we're going to pick up a few skills that buff that status effect type status effect. So Gut Punch synergizes nicely. So in terms of what Gut Punch the skill does, so now melee damage and ordnance damage have a chance to apply weakness to enemies for a duration. So because the whole point of this build is to get close to enemies, we're going to make sure we're trying to punch enemies as much as we can to maximize the chance of proccing weakness onto those enemies, making it easy to finish them off and also do more damage to them in case we can't kill them off immediately. We then pick up Forge and Steel in the tier 3, as well as the best defense and momentum. Forge and Steel is just a single point passive, gives Amon immunity for a brief duration whenever you activate a Forge skill. Now this isn't going to be constantly looped. Once again, it depends on the other things you have in terms of gear and cooldown reduction, but having immunity to damage is going to be useful anyway, just in case you proc your action skill, do your forge skill, get into an enemy's face and do as much damage as you can while being invincible. It's going to be a pretty nice utility. We then pick up momentum. What this does is gives Amon gun damage, and he also gains increased action skill cooldown rate for a duration. So whenever you deal gun damage with Amon, you get action skill cooldown rate, which ties in with Forge and Steel. Basically make sure you can keep looping that Forge skill abilities and maintaining your survivability as much as we can. We then also pick up the best defense, which gives Amon overshield whenever you deal melee damage. So once again, tying this in with a skill like Impetus, we're going to go and we're going to punch enemies, we're going to proc weakness onto them, try and finish them off as quickly as we can. In doing so, we're going to kill enemies, we're going to get increased shield regen rate, which ties in with overshield. Now, I'm not sure how overshield works in terms of shield regen rate, but at the very least, even our base shield will regen quicker with Impetus. But if overshield does work with shield regen rate, which it potentially might, ties in nicely anyway. But in any case, even if it doesn't, having overshield just helps anyway. You're going to be in close range of the enemies, so you're at risk of getting as much damage inflicted upon you as possible, so adding in skills like overshield where you can helps to pad out that survivability stat. In terms of the branch 3, we go all the way down to our capstone, but the skills that we pick up is, first one, catastrophe. So whenever Amon applies shock to an enemy, you get increased crit hit chance for a duration, and at the same time, whenever Amon applies burning damage to an enemy, you gain increased crit damage for a duration. So both of these things can be applied independently and not necessarily additively, but you can add them both at the same time to an enemy. So let's say you have a shock grenade and an instant weapon. You could throw that shock grenade at an enemy, set them on fire with your primary weapon, and you get both the benefits. So you get crit hit chance increases and crit damage increases. This ties in very nicely. We're also talking about increasing your melee crit hit chance with discombobulate, so maximize your chances to do a crit with your melee attack and also boost the damage offset crit by applying burning damage to the enemy. Ties in nicely. The next skill we pick up is Judgment. Very straightforward skill. Whenever Amon deals increased melee damage to enemies below 50% total HP. So as soon as enemy falls below that 50% HP threshold, Amon deals increased damage to those enemies. Ties in nicely with things like weakness. We're making them take more damage, so the likelihood of them getting put below that low HP threshold increases a lot quicker than it typically would. So we're able to get this effect and do more damage to the enemies as much as we can. Now, for the capstone that we pick up Stormcutter. What this does is, instead of that big hammer slab that he would have with the Onslaught skill tree, we now have this Stormcutter. Whenever you hold your action skill, you basically swing a huge incense sword that launches and deals shock melee damage to enemies as it passes through them, and each time it hits an enemy, you restore your action skill cooldown, your action skill duration, and ordnance cooldown as well. So this ties in nicely with a nifty little gameplay loop of getting into your enemy's face, punching them, applying weakness, trying to deal as much damage as you can with your shotgun or any other primary weapon that you choose, your melee attacks, and then also Stormcutter. You can loop this, get your action skill back as quick as possible, and it will tie in nicely with Forge and Steel. So because we're stacking on things to get your action skill back as quick as possible, we're also increasing the likelihood of us being able to reproc our Forge skills, which means we can reproc our immunity and keep that up. Now, I'm not saying this is going to make us invincible 24/7, but it does increase the amount of times we can be invincible in any sort of fight encounter. So having that ability to increase the survivability on a whim is going to be very useful. In terms of the branch 2 skills that we pick up, we start with Into the Fray. With this, Amon gains increased damage dealt and damage reduction based on his distance from the enemy. Amara from Borderlands 3 had a skill very similar to this, and I think a character from Wonderlands had the same thing. But point is that this helps very nicely with their close range playstyle. Because of this build, we're going to be in the face of our enemies, making sure that we can increase the damage dealt by being closer to the enemies and also take less damage from certain enemies. Basically a no-brainer pick for this skill tree. We then pick up Maiming Strike. Now this is another weakness skill. So Amon has 2, he has Gut Punch and he also has a Maiming Strike. Now instead of just melee damage and ordnance damage having a chance to apply weakness, we now also have the chance to apply weakness by hitting enemies with a crit from our guns. Now like I was saying before, weakened enemies deal reduced damage or take increased damage. But this is incredibly useful, as we're already going to be trying to proc weakness by meleeing enemies, but now we can get it by shooting them as well. So weapons with a high crit rate or lots of pellets, like I was saying in the previous build video that I posted earlier yesterday, ties in very nicely. because now we have multiple ways to proc this. So now you're not just locked into doing this from a close range. You can try and get at the close range, and if things start to get a bit hectic, you can pull back out of the fight, try and hit enemies at range, and still apply weakness from them, whether it be a sniper or assault rifle, or even shotguns, because let's be honest, even in Borderlands 3 that you had a shotgun, you could still snipe enemies with that from a decent enough range anyway. We also have a few points at Harbinger. This is a kill skill, gives Amon increased melee damage and maximum shield capacity for a duration. Don't really need to explain this much further, but depending on what you want your points to be into, you can put points into here. You can also put points into Burning Ramparts if you want to increase your fire rate and status effect chance the more full your shields are. We do have a few skills that increase shield regen rate and give you overshield, so this could tie in nicely. This is also a decent enough skill that you can try as well. Bloodlust, whenever your shield breaks, you gain Bloodlust, which gives you increased reload speed and lifesteal. So let's say you want to try a TDO type build, for example. Whenever you try and pull out of that close range gameplay and start just throw TDOs at an enemy, this can work nicely because your shield breaks and you can just spam reload, as TDO scales off reload speed. So if you're able to throw more weapons out at any given time, you increase your DPS technically. So this can tie in nicely as well. But there's a lot of different skills you can put in terms of your dump points. You also have rearm. This is a pretty fun skill to use because we're going to be in close range of enemies. If you're using things like shotguns, whenever you deal damage with a melee attack, the gun that you have equipped in your hand can also get reloaded. So you can have that loop of punch, your gun gets reloaded, you could shoot, punch, so on and so forth. But this is going to take a bit of testing depending on the chances that you get it, what gun you're using. This could change. But yeah, you have a lot of options is what I'm trying to say. So those are the main skills that you pick up. So the other augment that we pick up is Fellfrost. Now I don't know how viable this skill is going to be in game, or if it'll work as well as I think it does in my head, but on paper, looks incredibly fun. So what Fellfrost does is whenever you press your action skill immediately after using a rocket punch from the Onslaught action skill, Amon does basically another follow-up attack that deals cryo melee attack damage in a large area, but the kicker here is that non-boss enemies below 25% total HP are immediately killed. Now this ties in very nicely with the weakness skills that we have, like Gut Punch and Maiming Strike, and because we're going to be trying to put enemies down to as low HP as possible to proc things like Catastrophe and Judgment as well, we can synergize this very nicely. So Fellfrost ties in really nicely with the overall gameplay loop of getting in close range enemies, dealing as much damage with your melee, action skill, and your weapons, triggering executes on low health enemies, dashing back out, getting your shields and health back up, and going back into the fray. So that's the overall gameplay loop that I want to try and emulate in-game. Now once again, this build hasn't been tested. I will definitely be playing through this build when I have the chance to, when the game comes out. But yeah, that basically rounds out the build that I wanted to work through today. I hope you guys found it useful, or like I was saying in the previous video, gives you some sort of inspiration for some theory crafting before the game comes out, or a bit of a reference build to work through when the game actually does come out. I'm going to be posting probably one or two more before the game actually comes out, and then once that comes out I'm going to be testing all these builds properly, and I'll be releasing an updated version of this build with all the gear that works best with this build obviously, and some actual gameplay, because while looking at a skill tree as fancy as Mobalytics is, it's entirely different to see how the build plays in game. So that's definitely got to be my focus once the game comes out. But for now, hope you guys enjoyed this, and I'll see you guys real soon. Ciao.